the same positive attitude. And we have, thank God, we're both, we have everything we want. Why? Because we don't want that much.
Exactly.
So, you don't need anything.
Yeah, no, I found something wrong.
Who?
Even I had
But they spelled Shalom wrong. They used the current spelling. Yeah. In the current synagogue.
These explorations.
And what they thought it was.
And that was the we have still have to look for, we like fine dining. And that's all we have to look forward to. And our kids enjoy it also. So actually my daughter and son can't afford a lot of it, but they're still cool though. And they say, well, we can't go out of drop as you guys do. So we take my grandson. And the three of us go. They're down the block.
That's great. No, my wife was that was so every year we go at least one cruise or one flight. And even when I was when I had the husband at the first one, so I actually had a very I said, he says, yeah, this works.
Who had many?
39.
Oh, good, yeah. We still have one on no more. We don't get along about that, we don't talk about it.
So easy.
Yeah, but with women, it's not so easy. They have to put a thing in there, called fistula, and she's 84 years old. So, that's what she says. I mean, but I think the point is, she had a short the guy who told her about maybe 95 years old. So therefore, hopefully, she doesn't. It's just a precaution. It changes. I think it changes the percentage of getting coming back. 9%, 13%. It's not a great number. It shouldn't want to end up. I don't agree with that. But they have it. In fact, they have. And I really had to.
All right, everybody. Start. So as you recall, Paul Kaplan was here last year, giving us a talk on Irving Berlin, his book on Irving Berlin. He's also written books about Jewish Florida, South Florida, and also a book on Lillian Wall. And he also hit on a book about Jewish New York. But today, he's going to do a talk about Penn Station. So without further, and he's done many presentations to many other organizations. So without any further ado, I introduce Paul.
Hey, all right. Well, thanks everyone. It's great to see you. So like, as was said, this is my second time here. I was doing the Irving Berlin. How many of you were here for that a year ago? Yeah, you remember. Okay. So first, just want to start off by thanking the venue here and the president and the former speaker for everything that they do and all the volunteer work that they put in to make this place run. And Joel, and thank you so much for everything that you do. And I just wanted to also thank Armando Sagasti, who helped me like set up and kind of brought things here and really helping me out in many ways. So thank you, Armando, for everything that you do. And we have a guest here, Tim Cooper, who's my guest and recently did a tea at the Yale Club. So Tim's a comedy series writer and writes for award shows and writes for comedy series. So I think it's really exciting to have him here. And it's great. I'm glad you could be here, Tim. I hope you can come to many more. And everyone online, thanks for coming. How are we doing online?
We have about 8 or 9 people.
Okay, great. Yeah, so glad you could join us here. And I'm sort of going to be both addressing our in-person and our online. So just some kind of immediate housekeeping things. So one, just if you can keep your questions to the end, that would be great. Okay, so we can kind of get through all this. Although I'll be asking you some questions, and that includes you online people, but there's no cheating with Google or ChatGPT. So lay of the land, we're going to kind of do the talk. Then I'll take some questions or any like very succinct and relevant anecdotes. Maybe some of you were at the original Penn Station or your parents were. You can mention that if you want at the end. And then we'll do some signings and I'll kind of mention like some of these different series again. And then we'll call it a day, okay? All right, so with that, let's kind of jump in here let's sort of set the scene initially, okay? It is late November, 1910. It's a Sunday. And thousands of would-be passengers are at the opening of the original Penn Station. They are mesmerized with the beauty of the station. In fact, some oral accounts describe one visitor from Europe as weeping publicly to know that something this beautiful could be built. It was said it was like having ancient Rome or ancient Greece in your backyard. And not only was there an architectural wonder with all of this, but operationally, passengers were amazed that given that it was the first day, the trains were running on time, the logistics ran in something that no one said could be done, and connecting from Manhattan and from Long Island to New Jersey. So how did all this happen? What nobody knew in this crowd on this momentous day is that this station, which was built for the ages, would last only 53 years and eventually be the commencement of its destruction in 1963. So now we're going to go to the beginning of this timeline. I want you to know that in this particular talk, I'm going to emphasize the early history. We're going to go over that in the Pennsylvania station. I'm going to have very little, and we only have an hour together, including Q&A. So I'm going to have not much on, if you're expecting it, on Moynihan Terminal. But I do have a little treat for you, though, at the end, which is just to give you a heads up, which is, though I won't speak that much about Moynihan, there's a permanent art exhibit there, which is very symbolic and important and brings up really interesting questions about AI and photography. So I'm going to be talking about that too, which I think you'll really like. Okay, so let's move now to the beginning of our story. Okay, we're good. Now, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, and I'm going to be calling this PRR, okay? They were the largest corporation in the US. And what's important is they were really more than a company. They were a brand. They were a way of sort of thinking about doing business. Almost a little similar to Google today, you might say. It was sort of that larger than life company. And, you know, it was also had, I think, more employees than anyone else. Because keep in mind, we are now talking about the late 19th century. The Civil War is over. You have the Transcontinental Railroad, and that's the Pennsylvania Railroad Company owned a good portion of that. So it was developing the nation, but there was one problem, which is that passengers could not cross into Manhattan. You would basically have to get off in New Jersey and then take a ferry across in order to get to Manhattan. So I'm going to be peppering this with quotes, so you hear not just me, but other voices too. Passengers were highly inconvenienced. Every 10 minutes, a PRR ferry headed across the Hudson threading a gauntlet of ocean shipping ships, ferries, operated by other railroads, tugs. The congestion of watercraft on the Hudson became intolerable. So basically, you know, when you would arrive, not only would you have all the luggage you'd have to deal with, but you would get to like this rough and tumble West Street downtown. And it was very undesirable, the crime, it was kind of gloomy, foreboding. And also, if you think logistically, which is important in today's talk, right? Because this is a transportation company. And you want to think not only in terms of passengers, but in terms of freight. And that's a big part of the business too. So this, by not getting to Manhattan, there are business implications. You are creating a gridlock, thereby reducing the number of freight and passengers who can come in. So the PRR had wrestled with this problem for 30 years. They tried bridges, and some of this you could read about in the book here. Won't get into it here, but basically they tried to partner with other railroad companies, transportation companies to build bridges. It didn't work, basically, is the long and short of it, because the other companies balked at the price, and they did not want to get involved with that. So it was cost prohibitive, and you know, that was really it. They kind of like tried to come into Manhattan in different ways, but had trouble doing so. Okay, so in terms of competition, so PRR, something that is informing in the late 19th century, their thought also is the Grand Central Depot and then station. Now, what would eventually become the station around 1910, Grand Central today. Now, the PRR looked with some envy, shall we say, of their formidable competitor. See, the trains did connect to Manhattan running from upstate, like they ran east of the Hudson River, near the Harlem River and into Manhattan, and the bridges over the Harlem River at the head of Spoiton Dival. Now, Cornelius had started the Grand Central Depot in 1871 with 3 lines, the same 3 lines we have now, right? So that would be the New Haven, the Hudson, and the Harlem, and they merged. And this was what was then in remote 42nd Street, where it moved. But the Vanderbilts were very good at sort of predicting demand, and they foresaw that 42nd Street would eventually become a very busy area, and they were right. While they were very good at predicting demand, they were not good at customer safety and customer service. And frankly, they were very greedy and corrupt, and they had very little concern for passengers. And that was evident in a lot of the safety shortcuts that they took. And that was something that the PRR looked to as well. They thought maybe we can fix that. We can make this experience better. So we're talking about a different route, because that would be from New Jersey and Long Island. So they're not direct competitors, but they're looking at Grand Central and Vanderbilt and thinking, what should we do about all this? Okay, so let's talk about Alexander Cassatt. Now, Alexander Cassatt was the brother of Mary Cassatt. Who can tell me who Mary Cassatt was?
Painter.
Painter?
Very, very famous.
Famous painter?
I think he painted, I think, children.
Exactly right.
Right.
Excellent. What's your name?
Jean.
Jean, great job. So it's funny how things work. Hi. Hi, okay, right, I see. Okay, so it's funny how things work. Who ended up being famous in history is not really Alexander Cassatt, who we're gonna talk about with all this railroad material, but actually her sister. I mean, his sister's taught art history classes 101. Mary Cassatt, you know, paintings are in the Met, all over. She was an impressionist painting, there's a US postage stamp of her, and she did a lot of domestic scenes. It's funny how history works. Like, I mean, we're gonna talk about, you know, you'll see at the end of the talk how important what Alexander Cassatt did, but you know, people don't really know who he was. There's not even a statue of him or anything in New York. I mean, you have to really look. Now there's more about him in Moynihan, whereas his sister is sort of a household name. So what happens is the Pennsylvania Railroad Company is doing their thing, and the president, so Alexander Cassatt wants to be president. He has a vision of this, and he is looked over for someone else to be president. He's pretty mad. At age 42, he goes into retirement. He leads a life of leisure. Eventually, the president dies in office. And then he's succeeded by someone else. And this successor is described as a company man with little imagination. So a trade pub opined once about the successor, he is by no means a genius. So you have these sort of mediocre leaders. I don't think they're really trying to solve all this crossing of the river. I mean, that's a really dynamic challenge. Part of the underlying theme of today is about risk. It's about being audacious as a business leader, which they weren't until Alexander Cassatt came on the scene. So after 2 presidents, they both died in office. The board then goes to Cassatt and asks him to come on as president. And he kind of hesitates because I mean, the last 2 presidents died in office and he's kind of enjoying his life of leisure. It had been about 15 years now. So now I think he's in his about 56 roughly. And he says, all right, I will come, but on this condition, let me know what I need to make this company succeed, but I'm gonna call the shots. You board are not gonna be on my back about everything. If you're gonna micromanage, I don't want the job. Because Alexander Cassatt had a real vision and he didn't wanna just be like another cog in the system. So when he comes back to the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, because remember, it had been 15 years henceforth, totally different society. It had become the progressive era. Now, I have a whole separate book about this, which is New York in the progressive era, which we could do as a talk here sometime if you like. This is all about why this era was so consequential. What's important to know right here is how different society became, even just in 15 years, and how this would change the business environment for Pennsylvania Railroad Company. So this progressive year saw many significant reforms passed, the world was changing, and the population of New York City had gone from just a very unsizable amount in 1860 to about 5 million in 1910 because of the enormous immigration influxion. So Cassatt was an unusual businessman. Hi, you can still see. An unusual businessman, and there were 3 certain things were very important to him. So what was going on at the time? The large infrastructure projects, conservation was very important. So the game changed. You can't just as a railroad, like do whatever you want and just take land. Now you had to go through certain laws. And also the antitrust as well. So that was something that, that Alexander Cassatt wanted to root out. He wanted to take on the corruption and he wanted to do something very audacious, which is to get rid of a lot of the kickbacks that were happening. So labor was becoming also much more of an issue. And also he took that on head on, and he cared a lot about workers' rights, which kind of helped with all this. Okay, so now he is back in office, and we could talk about Cassatt now is feeling really discouraged in his quest to connect with Manhattan. So he is looking for visionaries. So while he's in Europe, Samuel Ray, the VP, suggests that he visits the Gare d'Orsay in Paris. Who's been to the Gare d'Orsay? Just now a museum in Paris.
Yeah,
Okay, so now it's a museum. But as you know, it was an important train station in Paris, and the station and the train cars were powered by electricity. And so Samuel Ray, and there's a statue of Samuel Ray on 7th Avenue, by the way, so right by Penn Station. So now when you walk by, it'll mean more to you. He thought about this and said, oh, what? They do this with electricity? Look at how they run the trains between Paris and London. I'm gonna look at this and I can get some ideas from this. So the trains also were more comfortable, they were safer. You know, this was fairly typical of the US looking towards Europe for inspiration. This happened in a lot of fields because the US was still kind of growing. Like for example, in fashion, as one example, it was always looked to Europe until the mid 20th century. So this would be another example of that. He saw in the Gare d'Orsay the white limestone, the stately clock tower, the graceful arches. And eventually, Cassatt then turns to Charles Jacobs, his chief engineer, and says, I want you to build something like this for me. And everyone's like, yeah, but the Hudson River is not hospitable to tunnels. And no one would have thought about tunnels at the time so much, but that was like a new innovation. And also, they had to deal with the corruption in New York and a great bureaucracy. So who are the key players? So the key players were Samuel Ray. He was from a working class. He worked his way up the PRR, started working at age 13. He was a big picture thinker. That's what made a lot of this work. He was a strategy person, and he gave Cassatt a lot of ideas. Then you have Charles Jacobs, who, like I said, he was the chief engineer. And here's the thing about him, he got his hands dirty. He wasn't just kind of giving the junior engineer people things to do. He was very involved with the path trains and getting the path trains up and running. Hence, he had a lot of experience in train development, tunnels, the details. This is all about details and making it work. And he could really, he's proven that as an engineer. And then Charles McKim, part of the very famed architecture, McKim, Mead, and White, right? Now, McKim, of the three of them, McKim was the most interested in aesthetics. So when I think about McKim, Mead, and White, you know, they did buildings at Columbia University, they did the Harvard Club. I've given a lot of talks at the Harvard Club, and people there are very kind of familiar with them, with that. And they've done like a zillion buildings. So with Charles McKim, they say, quote, he saw beauty wherever it was. And he insisted that things accessory to architecture and life should conform to his idea of good taste. So, you know, I sort of think of it as White was the playboy. You know, he had all these like girlfriends, and of course he had like this very dramatic and untimely death. He was getting into debt all the time. This company never would have worked if it was just him. He was always getting into debt. He probably gambled. He was very having all these lovers, even if they were married to other people. And Mead kind of made the company work. Like he sort of made sure that all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed. And that's the three of them kind of in a way like complemented each other. So Cassatt, he's the president, Armando, can I just have a little water too? So Cassatt taps, okay, thanks. So Cassatt, this is all great about engineering, but here's what I want you to get from this. Cassatt wants something bigger. He wants something really visionary, not just functional. And this is where you could fall and really, you're taking a big gamble as the leader, never mind the leader of the biggest company in the country at the time. But for Cassatt, that's why he took the job. He wanted to go big, even though it was very stressful, and we'll learn later would take a toll on his physical health, unfortunately. So he wanted a monument to express the importance of the railroad and ambitions of NYC that captured its sense of itself as a world capital, says historian Hilary Ballone. Cassatt was a unique executive. He had a grand vision, and he wanted the Pennsylvania Railroad to stand for the grandest, the noblest, and most elegant, the most inspiring. That's a quote from Paul Goldberger, who's an architectural critic, formerly with the Times. So that's all great, but how are you going to do it? Where are you going to get inspiration? Any ideas? What would you do if you were an architect? Where would you find some ideas?
Yeah.
Paris, what? Sometimes,
Rome.
yes, indeed. Sometimes though, and this is true, I think, in our own lives, I know, and I'll just say, like, I work in a corporate job besides being an author in technology services marketing. I'm no Alexander Cassatt, but I'm given like assignments to kind of come up with these. And I'm thinking, oh, how am I going to come up with these ideas? Sometimes I just let it lie, and I see things that'll give me an idea that I'll bring forth. You guys probably done that in your jobs too. That's really kind of what happened here on a gigantic scale. So McKim was actually on vacation in Rome, and he visited the Baths of Caracalla. Who's been to the Baths of Caracalla? It's right near the Roman Colosseum. No, people don't know about it. It's a great thing to know because it doesn't get tourists, and it's not crowded. So the Baths of Caracalla is from 200 AD, Roman Empire, a complex set of gyms, pools, spas, libraries, social centers, and you had the Frigidarium. That's right about. Okay, so you see here on the left what the Baths of Caracalla looks like today. If you were to go, this is what it looks like in virtual reality. That's what it would look like. Can we save questions to the end, please? No questions. Save this. So that's on the right. And so the Frigidarium was a monumental hall similar to a basilica. It inspired New York's Penn Station because it's the idea of this meeting place, right? Like it's a library and a spa and these rooms. So architecturally, this functional but aesthetic and symmetric meeting place. It inspired something else in the United States. What else did it inspire? Anyone know? It's another train station. What city?
Washington, DC?
No. Chicago.
Oh.
Chicago's Union Station, which I went to, and I researched for this. I went in person. So bathgoers, it served at this meeting point, like I was saying, the bathgoers would sort to other rooms, right? And its central location made it the fulcrum for movements of the bathgoers. That's what McKim was looking for. But he's thinking about Penn Station and how am I going to make this aesthetic, but it also needs to be efficient with the waiting room, with the ticket. This gave him the idea. So the main waiting room was, it was executed, it was inspired by the Baths of Caracalla and was executed in the steel framework clad in plaster. So the comparisons of the Penn Station and Baths of Caracalla are probably most apparent, I would say, like in these ways. The use of columns, ornate interior sculpture, the high use of ceilings to create a more spacious feel in spaces that were susceptible to overcrowding. How ironic. How ironic. Because, of course, we all know about overcrowding at the Penn Station now. Just goes to show. Both spaces had gallery areas where individuals could rest before going on to their next move. So for bathers, it would have been a case of walking from the sports courts to the saunas. For travelers at Penn Station, it might be from a rest stop or a lounge to, say, like one of the restaurants. But it's more than architecture, okay? Really, both places were a cultural symbol of the community they served. And that's what I wanted you to get from that. The Baths of Caracalla showed the exuberance of the wealth of Rome, as well as the artistry of the statues and sculpture that commemorated officials at the time, right? And Penn Station would ultimately be regarded as an architectural quality in precious materials to set the stamp of excellence in a city. That's what this is about. It's about having a station to match what New York City would eventually become. So, other inspirations? We have the Acropolia at Acropolis and the Piazza at St. Peter's. So, the St. Peter's Square where the Vatican is. I'm sure a lot of you have visited there, thinking about the space and architecture. McKim went there. And as far as Acropolis, how that ancient area was laid out. Okay, so we talked about a few things now. We mentioned about some of the engineering. We mentioned about some of the space. We mentioned some of the business implications. Now we have to talk about something else, which is probably the most fundamental thing. Where are you going to have it? What's the location? And what are the trade-offs around that? So this is where, once again, Alexander Cassatt was being audacious. This is something I think that we rarely see in business, I think. Leaders taking a stand, kind of taking a risk. I think that's rare, even today. Most will do the safest way and will cut corners a lot, for their companies. So that's sort of what makes this story special. So this district around where Penn Station is today, it was kind of a seedy neighborhood. It was known for gambling, rowdy saloons, clip joints, hotbed of corruption. And there was, definitely some homeowners and things like that. But it was it was a little seedy, and it certainly wasn't a place that you would imagine where the station would go. There was also a lot of blackmail too that was going on with certain joints. So Alexander Clubb Williams was a policeman, and he was reassigned to this beat. Now, a lot of the police were very corrupt, not everyone, of course, but it was a real problem. Alexander Clubber Williams was a really corrupt police officer. And he, the reason why, does anyone know why it's called the Tenderloin District? Yeah, it's kind of a hard question. Okay, and online, by the way, you're monitoring online?
Yeah, nobody.
Okay, I didn't know that, don't worry. So basically, Alexander Clubb Williams says, I've been having steaks since I've been on the force, but now, because what he's really saying is he's going to accept all these payoffs in the new area, I'm going to dine on tenderloin. That's the idea. Yeah, exactly. The best kind, most expensive kind. So basically, there were a lot of honest workers who lived there and some owned their houses, but kind of an unlikely place to build a station that would hark back to ancient Rome. So they went to secretly buying up properties, and the PRR, let me show you the slide here.
You don't have to point it at the screen,
Okay.
but let's see if it's, yeah.
Let's go to the next one.
I'm the problem because I
Okay.
switched over to Zoom to look for the chat that didn't exist. So
Okay.
try again.
Okay, great. So here in terms of secretly buying up properties. So PRR hires realtors to buy up properties, basically for between around 200,000 and maybe like $3 million in today's money, which is little by NYC standards. And they have no idea why the owners, what they're selling it for, because it was a heavily guarded secret. That is, if word leaked out that what they were buying it for, the prices would go through the roof, and some might refuse to sell it. So they used eminent domain, and just so we're all familiar, this could be used with a US Supreme Court case. If you could show that something's for the public good, you can force the sale, and that's up to the judges. And that's what they did. And I know that because I did a lot of original research for this book at the Pennsylvania Railroad Archives in Pennsylvania, and also in Wilmington, Delaware, which is where a lot of them are. So one of the things that I did in my original primary research is I went through archives and I personally saw, a lot of these legal orders. So then they had to find the owners, which was hard. But word started to leak out what it was for. No one knew exactly, but they had some idea. And then, then some owners tried to hold out. So then that made the other side say, well, but now we'll get eminent domain and we'll force you out. So take this price or the price will drop. Because at the end, you're not going to have it. If you want to gamble with the legal system, good luck. And maybe you don't know who's on the other side, but you kind of think it's a big company. They have a hell of a lot more resources than you for the legal system. So you'll give in because you'll want the cash, and they give in. Okay, so Tammany Hall corruption. So I think a lot of you know that Tammany Hall was a lot of the political institution of New York City. A lot of them worked with immigrants and like from Ireland and Italy and other places, and kind of like met some of their basic needs and pretty much forced them to keep voting for them. It was a lot of ballot stuffing, but there was also a lot of forcing of vendor selection, shall we say. Because the big question would be who's actually going to build the station? I mean, this is a hell of a lot of money to make if you're a vendor. And you want this business, and who's going to get it? I mean, this would be like getting the most prized contract from like Google or something like that today. So Tammany Hall kind of has a veiled threat on the selection of contractor for the new station. And they paid the PR headquarters a visit, and they basically said, we have the right people to build the station, and we'd like to work with you. And if you don't want to work with us, you don't have to. But good luck in getting a subway station here when we build the subway. Good luck in getting things approved for the city. And we're going to make your life extremely difficult. So that's kind of what would happen. These sort of veiled threats happens today all the time. So subway opened in 1904, and the planned subway stops become very political, right? Like where the subway goes can really make or break your business. And that was crucial for developing the area. So that was still in question about whether it would stop or Penn Station would be. Okay, but eventually Alexander Cassatt did not want to give into that. And they wanted to have their own vendor kind of build it. So he really worked on that path. Now, the next thing is in terms of the tunneling. So the engineering news record here, I have this quote, the most extensive and difficult piece of submarine tunnel work ever undertaken. You have to understand, okay? You have to take a moment here and understand how physically impossible it would have been to build something called tunnels, which you probably wouldn't know what I was talking about if I was mentioning this at the time to you, under very turbulent waters of the Hudson River and the East River. Maybe you read about it happening elsewhere, somewhere, but to think it would happen there, it wouldn't even cross your mind. You would have just thought about bridges. So a lot of engineering folks said, you're never going to be able to do it. And the sediment was about the most treacherous material through which submarine tunneling had ever been attempted. Now, who did this work? These were the Sandhogs. And this is extremely grueling work. They were in a contained space. And I always think it's good when, you know, we go through tunnels and bridges and all these things. You know, even things like the Panama Canal as an example, like more in the news today. You know, just take it, we sort of take it for granted. I know that I do. But you have to think about the grueling work that the people did to build it. So they were in a contained space, and it was a melting pot of Black, West Indian, Italian, Irish, and Polish. And they always had to be on guard for a blowout. So that was when there was a blow of compressed air, the pressure would drop in the tunnel, and the results could be catastrophic. And the escaping air could create a geyser. And this was extremely dangerous. So you'd come to work never knowing, honestly, if you would be okay. Now, one of the biggest problems that they had was when they would, so the two teams, just speaking of the Hudson River, okay, half the team would be in New Jersey, half was in Manhattan. They were building the tunnels to meet exactly. The tunnels had to align within 1/8 of an inch. Now, as they were building these tunnels and trying to meet, one of the problems was as you got through the silt, it then would kind of like come back, and it would cover up a lot of the work that you had just done. So the way that they came up with is building a shield ring to advance through the silt and the sand. And there were like these cast iron plates or like sections of rings, like 200 tons, and they would go through the sand and kind of keep it from like resettling. You also had the bends, which was very, very painful. So if you came up too quickly from the surface, just like in scuba diving, where divers have this problem, or sea scientists that work in sea, like aquatic scientists, the bends was very painful. You would literally bend over because you were in so much pain. It is life-threatening. So Cassatt did a lot to counter that. He had warm baths, he had coffee, he had warm clothes. The treatment of the workers for this period was exemplary in many ways. But that doesn't mean people still didn't die from this. But to be fair, it wasn't all, you know, sometimes it was the workers' fault. And some of them smoked where they shouldn't, you know, and people break rules. And so the accidents were from both sides, to be fair about it. So in terms of the conditions, I wanted to get you a quote. Never mind me telling you. I wanted you to hear from an actual sandhog. Oh, sorry. The other way. Okay, so take a look at this quote here. It's grueling. There's tremendous power down there that needs to be used. And if you're in the wrong spot at the wrong time, you're gonna get crushed. And when you're in a confined space, there is nowhere to run. So that kind of shows you a lot of the precarious conditions. Now, another thing with this is the Long Island Railroad. So this had been in operation since the mid-19th century. This was not a new thing, the LIRR. But in 1900, the PRR buys a controlling interest. And the president of LIRR is William Baldwin Jr. Now, Baldwin Jr. is known in history, not really so much as president as the LIRR, though that's our purpose today. He is known, just to let you know, if you see his name around, for a lot of great educational efforts for newly freed slaves and Black Americans in the late 19th century. So he was president of Tuskegee University in 1894, and he partnered with, are you familiar with Booker T. Washington? Yeah, he partnered with Booker T. Washington, and he also gave a lot of like money and time for education. And so this was a really great partnership that the two of them had. But it was, you know, this whole notion of the two tunnels aligning was very, very nebulous. And the truth is, okay, the truth is, nobody knew if it would work. So here, the Pennsylvania Railroad they have risked like everything for this. And, you know, this really weighed on Alexander Cassatt, because he didn't know if once you started running trains, it's one thing to have the tunnels, but would they withstand the weight of it? And this secret, I would say, very much played Jacobs as well, the engineer. So in terms of the Hudson River, this was considered one of the greatest engineering feats in worldwide engineering history. They were able to align it within 1/16 of an inch. They had a huge celebration, 3 cheers for the Sandhogs. The alignment of the tunnels was amazing, engineers tell me, even by present day standards. But again, even though you had that, you still have a way to go. So the East River proved to be much more difficult because of the terrain, the sediment, and the roughness of the water. So in May 1906, the New York Times reported the geysers formed by the leaks have made the water in the ferry slips look like boiling lakes. So there was an ominous whistling sound and a sign that the compressed air was leaking, which causes blowouts. Now, blowouts were causing injuries, deaths, and they were putting the project over budget and under schedule. This came to a head in June 1906. Now, all this and what we were talking about was a little bit inside baseball. You know, those who knew about what's happening with engineering, but the media wasn't that much reported in mainstream papers. This would change because of June 20th, 1906. Unsuspecting commuters on a ferry on the East River witnessed a giant geyser. Sandhogs below the surface, which they wouldn't have known because it was below the surface, were running for their lives. 2 died, 14 died in the bends. That's it. At this point, reporters stepped in. Reporters demanded to know what the PRR would do to reduce the number of blowouts. And so they hire Ivy Lee, what would you do at this point? Let's say you had this horrible accident happen. And now you have the media around you. Any ideas? What would you do? Let's say you're running this company.
Hire a crisis consultant.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. But you would expect that answer today, and you're a crisis consultant. So for those of you on Zoom, a PR, a crisis consultant, that's what people do today. But you really didn't have PR as a field like you do now. So that's what they did. But it was an unusual move at the time. So they hired Ivy Lee, a PR pro, and he created the story. What he was able to do, he did a lot of corrupt things later in his life. I have to tell you, he supported a lot of bad regimes, but that's for another talk. He created the story, not just the dry facts. That's what a good crisis person will do, and show why this is important to do. And he invited the media, because now he was like the PR hired him as like a freelance PR person. Okay. So one of the things he did was he went to the media and he said, I'm going to give you a tour of what's happening. Right. So rather than keeping them out, which is the instinct of a lot of companies, they invited them in. So there was a magazine called World's Work magazine who came in, and it didn't work. The reporters were freaked out by being under the water that much, and they didn't care about the tour, and it didn't work so well, but at least they got to see some of it. So what you have here is like a riffs in the PRR. So I put this together to kind of show you visually, so we could encapsulate a lot of the impediments that we have so far delineated. So you have Mayor Seth Lowe was a very, very good and honest politician who worked with the PRR, but he was elected out of office. You start having a lot of health issues. Charles McKim and Alexander Cassatt, unfortunately, have pretty significant health issues and aren't able to work on it as much. And then we talked about the subway, the blowouts. You're growing a lot of debt. Stocks, it's a publicly traded company, so you have a lot of pressure. Skeptical media, and then some of these property things. So, just to give you that. And then, sadly, you have the death of a beloved rail leader. So Alexander Cassatt died in December 1906. So he died never knowing if the station would ever be built. And he also died never knowing the legacy that he would build, which is fairly common. I mean, I've written a lot of biographies, and a lot of these guys or women could never have known in their lifetime what they built or the incipients, what it would become, right? Even like Irving Berlin or Cole Porter. I mean, yes, they were famous in their lifetime, but they wouldn't know that there'd be the legacy that they've had. So it was very disappointed. The PRR, they loved him. They were really sad to see him go and see him pass. And also, another president died in office. This is the third person in a row who died in office. And William Baldwin Jr., I mentioned before, the president of LIRR, so he died in 1905. So the sad part is the people who were really behind a lot of this never got to see it. They died not knowing if this would even work. So the excavation site, this is a painting that was in the Brooklyn Museum collection that I visited. And it was like a huge pit. They say it was like our own Panama Canal on the west side. Spectators found it thrilling to watch. Occasional explosions that reverberated throughout the neighborhood. And there were like jolts that you would hear in the neighborhood. One man thought it was an earthquake. One thought Judgment Day had arrived. So let's now forward wind. You could read in the book all the things that happened, a lot of really interesting twists and turns. But as I commenced this talk about the station, and the station that was built for the ages on that late November Sunday in 1910, and like having ancient Rome in your backyard. And this is also about the marvel. It was also, I think, a few things. Number one, the building materials that they had to get were, just think about the vastness that you would need. It was in Beaux-Arts style, 84 Greek Doric columns, 150 feet vaulted ceilings, the glass and steel soared to make it one of the most breathtaking train sheds ever built. The large waiting room was a block and a half long, the eagles perched on each side. So building materials, they needed 27,000 tons of steel, 500,000 cubic feet of granite, 83,000 square feet of skylight, 17 million bricks. First of all, sourcing all this, that's A. B is, how are you gonna get all this into Manhattan? So just think about we talked about the building of it, but the logistics and the movement of materials. But another thing is thinking about the station itself and what it meant to some of the public. So this is the original, the floor plan of the original Penn Station. You see it was kind of similar to, really to what it is now. I mean, the outline is really the same. And there's things that are the same now, which we'll talk about later. But this is like how it looked, the waiting room, and you see that there. So this, I'm now going to present a larger point to you, which is, what is the role of architecture in a city? It has the ability, at its finest, to uplift and inspire the public. Now, I know from oral history accounts that although this was privately owned at the time by Pennsylvania Railroad Station, and by the way, when something's privately owned, there's pros and cons. There's definitely pros, because you can get things done much faster. But it was privately owned, but passengers felt like it was public, like they kind of owned a piece of it. And it's how they felt. Forget about whether or not that's true. So like there was one woman, just as an example, I'm just giving you one example of many oral accounts. She came from a more lower income part of New York, and not, a neighborhood that was not in great repair. But she says in this oral account, when she walked through Penn Station, in the 1910s, she felt like a queen. And that's what architecture can do. It can uplift you. It can make you feel something larger than what's really there. Thomas Wolfe captured in You Can't Go Home Again. The station was murmurous with the immense space and distant sound of time. Here, as nowhere else on earth, travelers were brought together for a moment, for the beginning or end of their innumerable journeys. Here one saw their greetings and farewells. Here, in a single instant, one got the entire picture of human destiny. Passengers came and went. They passed and vanished. All were moving throughout the moments of their lives, but the voice of time remained aloof and unperturbed, a drowsy and eternal murmur below the immense and distant roof. So that's an excerpt that I wanted to have for you. concourse, the clock and station. And of course, the clock is very popular, it's very iconic. And, you know, you can see that in some movies. There's a Judy Garland movie called The Clock. It was filmed at MGM Studios in what's now Sony Pictures in LA, in Culver City. So is it the real clock? No. Is it the real Penn Station? No. This was during World War II when they filmed it. I mean, first of all, they didn't film on location anyway in those days, but the last thing they were gonna do in World War II was do that. So is it the way to see the real thing? No, but close enough. I think the set designer probably came and tried to make it. So you can watch that Judy Garland movie if you like. It's in a lot of Alfred Hitchcock movies. Okay, so moving ahead, first decade, a lot of unanticipated issues. So the biggest mistake that they made, these planners, was, and I went through a lot of the minutes, as I said in my research, my primary research at the New York Public Library, the Pennsylvania Railroad Archives in person in Wilmington, Pennsylvania. Some of the minutes, they basically say, like, we misjudged the commuter traffic. They thought it was gonna be all this long distance. And it really wasn't that much, because you would start to get, of course, you know, later, planes and cars being much more in use. But commuting, there was a big demand for it. So you also had under-service LIR passengers. That's probably the biggest mistake that they made. The demand that would eventually come from there, and the waiting rooms were too small from that. They did not get a subway stop. There's no subway stop there until 1918, because they didn't have the political clout. The neighborhood, I read a lot about this in the minutes. And so remember, when I go through all there's literally 100 boxes in these archives. So what I'm doing as the researcher and author is I'm looking for the story, right? Like, you don't need to know every little detail about every meeting they've had. So I sort of did that work for you, so you can really kind of get to the meat of it. And something that I found, which was interesting, is that they didn't feel, like, now it's the 1920 or so, they did not feel like the neighborhood was developing as much as it needed to be. Okay, so you had the pandemic of 1918 to 1920, as you all know. But Penn Station was open. You see, like, more masks and things like that, but it's just sort of still operated. But what you had right before that was the US entry into World War I, and they nationalized the station. A lot of things in the US were nationalized during World War I. That was very common. So the government nationalized it and used it for the transporting of armies and so on and so forth. And it all sort of played a big role in this. A year ago, you were at the Irving Berlin talk. So I mentioned about Irving Berlin in World War I and about the plays they put on, right? Because you were there, you remember. So this is all sort of in line with that. But I'll tell you what, nationalizing the station, it put a lot of wear and tear on the station. But then in the 1920s, this was really the heyday for glamorous travel. So what they started to do was, now they've got into more marketing, okay? How can you package this in an interesting way? How can you have a travel package whereby you want to go from New York City to, well, see, LA wasn't really a thing yet in the 1920s, but let's say you wanted to go to parts of California that were a little more blooming. It wouldn't be cross-national, but you could take like a little plane and then you go here. And then I've seen advertisements for it, and then you can take the train for part of that. So they kind of had these disjointed journeys. Didn't work that well, wasn't that much interest in it. But the 20s were also about glamorous travel. You know, you had Charlie Chaplin, celebrities taking it. You had enormous, almost just joy in riding the subway, in riding these trains. And this would happen, you know, in the book you can read about the Depression. The Depression was a problem because it greatly slowed down freight and passenger demand. But this is what's interesting. It's not what did the PRR in, because they survived it all. They did not report any losses, any significant financial losses until the late 1950s. So they were able to manage it all. Then I'm sort of forward winding. You can read in the book about some of these decades. But in the 1950s is where you start getting into some trouble. So, by the way, World War II, these are some pictures from World War II. You see some of the military in the station. It was a little bit of a kind of a little informal segregation. What you had in the station also was a lunchroom, like a dinner room. You had a lot of different shops, but it wasn't really a destination, a shopping destination area. And the men and women were separated, by the way, in the beginning, and that was common. That's how a lot of things were. I mean, frankly, I've given 97 talks, you know. A lot of clubs that I speak at were separated. Like they spoke at the Yale Club, the Harvard Club, they were all separated by gender, males and females. I mean, that's like a lot of some of the clubs I spoke at didn't even have women until like the 80s or something. So, but those are social clubs. Speaking of the station, just in the first decade, you had the men and women separated with some of the different dining facilities, the barber shops, and then the genders became integrated in the 1920s. So, moving ahead now from the 1940s, but this was also a scene of great farewells to loved ones who you may never see again. I mean, this was really, you would never know what would happen to them. And then in 1945, this was also a scene of like a lot of the, you know, you've seen like the photos of a lot of the welcoming home of the soldiers. So that's all great. But in the late 1950s, you start getting financial losses. So there was a competition from the airplane. You had the substitution of the automobile in the 1950s. Now, as you all know, that starts with the Ford, and I went to the Ford Paquette, where he came up with the idea for the Model T. I actually went there myself and researched it, which is part of the New York in the progressive era. And I looked at some of the ads to talk about it here. And but it didn't really come into full play with an infrastructure and also at a price that a middle-class person could afford until subsequent decades. So that's why I say the car was more of a threat. I mean, you'll say, yeah, but there was a car, there were different models of the car before that, sure. But we're talking about it as a real commodity and a real threat to the company. There were high taxes relative to competitors and regulations. The PRR also felt that they were unfairly singled out with a lot of the regulations. They didn't get the tax breaks that a lot of these other industries were getting that were their competitors. And they decided that in the early 1960s that they had to make a major change because they were losing money. So this is a terrible decision in many ways, and we'll go over why. But I just want to present also why they did it. So they did it because they felt that if they tore down the station and made use of the airspace, they would partner with the Madison Square Garden entertainment and they would get half the revenue. So they thought that they basically thought they would diversify their business model by taking in the partnership money from that. And they would be less reliant on a lot of the declining work. So, but they were wrong on many fronts, and forgetting the architecture and all that, just from a business standpoint, it was a failing decision because they didn't make much money from the air rights and the partnership deals were not favorable to them. And the numbers don't lie, and it did not ameliorate their poor financial decision. So if we look at the early 1960s, there were protests, and there was the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York. Now I interviewed, so one of the things I try to do is I look for eyewitnesses and I use LinkedIn to help me, or I go through articles and I find people, and then I reach out to them on LinkedIn. And I say, you know, why don't I meet you? In this case, I met someone in person, you know, he's an older man. He was a architectural photography here. And he actually came to some talks, by the way, on this topic. I don't know if he's still alive, but this was a little while ago. And I also licensed some of the photos in the book. You know. So he basically said the protest, because he saw it himself, the protests were like no match for those that wanted to demolish it. Because what you didn't have was awareness about architectural preservation in the 50s and the early 60s. And don't forget, they wanted to tear down Carnegie Hall. You wouldn't have Carnegie Hall either, by the way. That was only saved because of Isaac Stern and a bunch of musicians saying that, and you know why they wanted to tear down Carnegie Hall? They thought you can't have Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. There's not enough business. But they're wrong. A lot of times these people are totally wrong. And you have to kind of look at that to say, the so-called experts have it completely wrong. So did the unions want to destroy it or not? What do you think they thought? What would unions think about this?
They'd say go for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Unions say go for it, because for them it's just work.
Right.
So you had this really sad destruction. And you see the eagles being taken down. And this was done over many years. October 28th, 1963. Until the first blow fell, no one was convinced that Penn Station really would be demolished, or that New York would permit this monumental act of vandalism against one of the finest landmarks of its age. But see, what happened is the station became less valuable than the real estate around it. That's really what happened. So over several years was the demolishment of it. Now, keep in mind, this is concurrent to the operations of it. So you have the trains, but you also have, I mean, that's why it took so many years, because they had to kind of do both at the same time. Basically, what they created was something far inferior. So I have this quote. Who here knows Vincent Scully? Raise your hand. Yeah, you heard of it from Yale. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Vincent Scully was the, yeah, Vincent Scully.
Not the same.
Darkness is soon as.
That's why
But this gentleman behind you, say it again.
I think the nickname for his course was, my college is Welsh, like Yale, so we know the Yale people. I think the nickname of his course was Darkness at Noon, because you turn the lights out and show slides or something.
So Vincent Scully was an art history professor. I had him when I was at Yale. He was very, 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 very famous, iconic professor. And he made sure his thing was more like the ancient Americas art, but he had a lot to say about all this. And so this is an actual quote. It's misquoted a lot. This is the actual quote. I made sure of it. Brewitt, you okay with that? Yeah. Brewitt, Penn Station 1, entered the city like a god. One scuttles in now like a rat. So, what remains of all this? So what remains in this, I'm speaking of this Penn Station, not the Moynihan Terminal. I'll mention that in a minute. So you have a number of things. Inside the kitchen at Zaro's Breadbasket is the station's original brick floor in unmistakable pattern. Overlooking a wine rack inside Penn and Wine Spirits is a segment of vintage glass bricks. So that was once a floor and now a ceiling, right? By the storage room is a plaque to the baggage handlers who served in World War II. This plaque is there from like 1948. The power plant is still there. West of Gate, New Jersey Transit tracks 5 and 6, the original brass and iron staircase that still leads to the platform. In the waiting room, I think I have, in the waiting room, you also have in the waiting room, you have the iron gate, and that's still there. So I think I have a picture of that here. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, upper left. Yeah, so that's still there. Post office in 1913, which was right across the street. So McKim, Mead and White built the post office. And that makes perfect sense, because for the post office system, you want to be right where the trains are, so you can deliver the mail efficiently as this major hub in the United States. And that, though it's Moynihan Terminal and all of that, there still is a post office there. So I would say that remains. 2 eagles and a statue of Samuel Ray, which I mentioned before. The other eagles are scattered. They're all over. They're in like, I mean, one of them is in the Long Island station, and they're in Maine and in the Midwest. And they're just sort of like classic pictures of the old Penn Station. Now, in terms of, I mentioned a lot of the really wonderful architectural elements of Penn Station, the original, but it wasn't perfect. And what were some of the flaws of it? So here were some examples. There was a hefty walk from the platform to the street. They say it was like climbing a mountain. The long walk to the ticket office and the long narrow stairs to the train. It was definitely hard for disabled, because there was not like the whole awareness about all that. Inbound passengers got confused on the directions of how to exit. Stone, it fared kind of poorly over time, especially that there was like a lot of the smog and so on. it was not built, like I mentioned before, with the LIRR or commuters in mind, and that was quite underserviced. Architectural Record was not all that impressed with parts of it. And they had some sort of sarcastic comments about it. So let me just now say a few words about Moynihan Terminal, which, as you know, opened across the street. So this was like a rendering of it before it opened. So the Moynihan across the street, a couple things. The amazing, they tried to bring back some of the resplendence and original architectural elements of the original. So you have like the glass, the sunlight coming in, some of the techniques in the original to relieve overcrowding or the perception of overcrowding. A lot of the original contours of the steel trusses and beams is another example. But there are also some artistic elements that I wanted to point out. If you go to Moynihan Terminal, you can notice the following. There is more about Alexander Cassatt. There's a timeline in the baggage where you can retrieve your baggage if you're taking Amtrak or something. And that timeline delineates many of the events that I have spoken about today. You okay? Okay. It delineates that, so take a look at that. And I actually did a co-talk at the Harvard Club with the person that Governor Cuomo, at the time, Governor Cuomo, appointed to oversee all this. And he kind of spoke about that. Unfortunately, he passed away during the pandemic, although not from COVID. But he was written up in the New York Times, so you could Google all that. But he was wonderful. His name was Chris Evans. You know, I think another thing with this is the artistic elements. So one of the things is they have wonderful art exhibits. And I am going to tell you about one, and then I'm going to give you a quote, and we're going to wrap up and do some Q&A or some little anecdotes, some signings, and we'll call it an event. Okay. So I just want to end by describing this artwork in the Moynihan Terminal. Why did I pick this to describe? For time, I didn't want to go into too many of the different elements, but I think this encapsulates a lot of the themes of this talk. So in the ticketed passenger waiting room, you have photos that you could see. And the photos are, yeah, so the Moynihan Terminal artwork. So these are some of the photos here that you can see in the waiting room. These are photos of the original Penn Station, not real photos. They're AI. I'm gonna get to that in a minute. So what's really interesting about this is this artist, he's Canadian, in I think 2020, somewhere around there, he had this idea of capturing certain moments of original Penn Station that are not well known. And he wanted to encapsulate these moments visually. And he did so by recreating certain scenes. He used the following sources. So articles and history accounts, architectural drawings, and he found a few of these fortuitous moments and hired actors to recreate them. And they dressed up in costume and period costumes, which is what they're doing in some of these. I know the lighting is hard, but they're in like the period costumes. And then he kind of filmed them and photographed them. But here's the other thing. With the help of the architectural drawings, the articles, the historical renderings, he recreated with AI images, the original Penn Station, in conjunction with the real life actors who were dressed up in that period. And together, he kind of put them together. So Ted, that's something that we have talked about before, about this new part of the terminal, the period photos. So by having that, he was able to capture that. So one moment that I'll share with you is in 1915. Are you familiar with the performer Burt Williams? Burt Williams was one of the most famous Black vaudeville and actor and singer at the time. Okay, kind of like pre-Broadway in 1915. There was a big snowstorm back when New York got snow, which it obviously does not now, but it used to. And so there was a snowstorm and everyone was sort of like trapped in Penn Station on a day or two in 1915. And Burt Williams created this impromptu vaudeville scene. You see that here? Like with the kind of acting here, this is all impromptu. And he created that as entertainment for the passengers who were stranded in Penn Station. That was done by Burt Williams. So I think that there are other moments that he captured. For example, during the Depression, he captured some of this World War II stuff, and some other moments as well over the 53 years. So I think it brings up a lot of really important things. How do you illuminate important moments? What kind of sources do you use? How do you put this out to the public? This is not a temporary art exhibit, I don't think. I think this is there permanently. Hence, the art in Moynihan Terminal is more central. It's not a side thought. You know, in a lot of places, sure, if you like really look, you'll find some art somewhere. But here, it's like the center show. I mean, you're sitting waiting because you have your Amtrak ticket. The photos are all big and right behind you. They're making a big statement. And we have to mention about AI, you know, and that's going to be a huge thing now moving forward in society. Huge, the hugest thing, I think, in anyone's lifetime. So, you know, what are the ethics around AI? And, you know, I think AI could be used for good and for bad. I would say in this case, it's for good because, you know, he didn't have it. I mean, sorry, he didn't have the photos from 1915. So he's recreating it and he's getting actors to dress up in it and kind of recreating that. You just have to be careful in what you disclose about what's AI and what's all the photos that I use, for example, here are actual real photos. So with that, I will wrap up with this final quote. Penn Station represents the aspiration of creating something noble, to inspire in the everyday, of private enterprise, providing something extraordinary for the public and for future generations. In the end, though, a balance is needed between the need to preserve and the need to grow and change. For that is what living places must do. And there you go. That's the talk. Oh, yeah, see, just 1 second. So before we get to the questions, just to mention a few things, and for folks on Zoom as well. So, you know, as I mentioned, this is my second talk. I did the Irving Berlin. You know, I do like the ethnic kind of travel, and those are really fun talks on New York and South Florida, New York in the progressive era, Lillian Wald, who started the Henry Street Settlement, which probably many of you in the visiting nurse service. And then I write business books as well. So these are all on sale for a discounted price just of 20 plus tax, and then the Irving Berlin at 15, and I can give you like a nice signed book. So that's number one. Thank you for being in the audience, both Zoom and in person. I also want to thank George Calderaro, who's the executive director of the Tin Pan Alley American Popular Music Project. And that's an organization where I volunteer with, and could be like a great partner in many ways. Couldn't come today in person, but I think he's online. With that, let's open it up to some questions or some succinct anecdotes. Yeah, so I see the three of you. Let's start with you.
I just have two quick anecdotes.
Yeah.
So one is Ben's. My uncle worked on but Brooklyn Battery Tunnel.
Right.
And it's the same situation. He came up fast one day, and a police officer saw him swaggering down the street. First thought he was drunk, but he recognized the Benz. He got into a decompression chamber in about 5 minutes and saved his life, but he lost his hearing completely in 1 year. So the situation is very similar to what you were describing. So it was a very hazardous disease, lethal, and it was not necessarily recognizable. And fortunately, this police officer recognized it.
And did his hearing never come back?
No, it was gone forever. 1 year is completely deaf because the bubbles burst the ear.
All right, yeah, go ahead.
Three things.
Okay.
You mentioned the demolition started in 1963.
Right.
2 years before the Landmarks Commission was established.
Right.
So that could have saved a lot of Penn Station. Also, you mentioned.
Oh, excuse me, just before you go on, so let me answer that. Great point. So let's talk about that. So the landmark conservation and so many efforts to save architecture in a way were born from the destruction of Penn Station. And so what's your name again?
Ron.
Ron. Okay, so Ron's point, I think, let's enlarge your point. I think that it was really about a consciousness about saving things. You didn't have that as much, like I was saying. It's not even just the actual details of it. You didn't have the public outcry about it. This made the public more interested. Here's another thing. US Supreme Court cases, whereby a lot of the cases ruled in favor of the city, like in other words, rather than the developer. And that made a lot of communities across the country say, oh, well, maybe we have rights too, all over the country, and perhaps we can prevent certain destructions as well. So I just want to give you an example. The other week I was speaking on the Jewish South Florida, and something I mentioned there is this woman, Barbara Kappeman, who came from New York, and she helped save with Leonard Horowitz. So this is a perfect example of what you're saying. The Art Deco hotels of Miami Beach, because that's similar too, but 10 or 20 years later. Miami was in a huge downturn in the 1980s, and maybe even early 90s. And so South Beach, right. And I'd say Little North of that. And you lived there at the time. If you lived there at the time, so you would really know.
I know very well.
You know
I
very well.
I worked those hotels.
Wow, that's amazing. So you know very well.
Yeah.
So as you would know, like some landlords were kind of like walking away from properties or not caring that much, like more like in the early 80s, I want to say. And Barbara Kappeman came up with an organization of the Miami Design Preservation League. Have you heard of that?
No.
It's right on the Miami Beach, and that's where they're preserving a lot of the Art Deco hotels. And Leonard Horowitz painted them to make them look colorful and that you really want to save them. So why do I mention this? Because that's a good example of what Ron just said, but even forget New York, other areas to exhibit that. And here's the thing, I can prove that Barbara Kappeman's whole Miami Beach thing, her inspiration and what made her want to save a lot of the Miami Beach hotels was this. She was around during all this, and it really had a big impact on her. So fast forward a decade or so, and then she goes down and does that. And there's examples of that all throughout the country. But Grand Central, of course, also would have been torn down. And that was a lawsuit ultimately between the city of New York and the Central Railway Station, and part of this became bankrupt eventually. And that went through a million courts, and as it always does. And you also had eventually the Supreme Court ruling in the city's favor. But you had to have the politics, the mayor's interested. You had to have some celebrity push. Everyone knows about Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy, others as well. But her fame is not to be underestimated in giving a movement that. So all these things, I think, contribute to what you're saying on like a real national level. What was your other question?
Yeah, two things. You mentioned in the 1950s, the automobile. When Dwight Eisenhower became president, he established the international highway system.
Yeah.
So now you were able to drive to California, not through these little towns, and it takes so long. You can drive on an interstate highway from New York to California. And also, in the beginning, while all the workers were working under the river, I'm imagining in my mind the demolition that was going on above ground to where the station is going to be. So all that neighborhood was being demolished at the same time.
Yeah. Great points. So as we mentioned before about the car really being a threat to the PRR, while decades before it was the incipience of the car with the various models of the Ford and General Motors and so on. But when it became this sort of like commodity, and B, an infrastructure to support it with the highway, you didn't have to go through small towns. It was much faster to get to your destination. It made it much more feasible. You probably would have taken the train because you wouldn't want to deal with driving throughout all these small towns. Plus safety, you have to go at a much slower speed. Now on the highway, you don't have to worry about a lot of that. And sort of the notion of American travel, and yet that commoditization of it also occurred. It became more commoditized. It became a little more utilitarian. in contrast to the 1920s, as I previously delineated, with a lot of the customized and the glamour and kind of making this unique experience. What was your other question? That's it. Okay. Let me just get a hand and then.
A simple question. Why Pennsylvania Station, not New York Station or Manhattan Station?
Okay. The answer, so this gentleman's asking about why is it called the Pennsylvania Station? Quite simply, because it was the Pennsylvania Railroad Company.
Oh, Pennsylvania.
And they, you know, they had stations all over and it was really about them.
All right.
Yeah.
That's why it's also Penn Station, Newark,
Mhm.
Oh.
same company.
And Baltimore. Penn Station's not just like a New York City thing.
It's all around. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead.
And when you had, not my question, but when you, Gene, when you also had several companies using the same facility, that's why you had Union Station.
Yeah.
Okay, in Chicago and
Washington.
Washington, that's it. Houston stations.
One of the ironic things,
I'm
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
one of the funnier, it wasn't funny, but it was strange situations about the FDR funeral was the train had to come up through Jersey, under the tunnel, into Penn Station, under the tunnel. And because there was no linkage between Grand Central and Penn, the train had to go all the way up to New Rochelle. And then come back on the New York Central to the Bronx to go up to Hyde Park. No one in the borough of Manhattan, because everything was underground, no one saw the funeral train in Manhattan. Unless they got up on the wall to look down in what's now Hudson Yards, and you can't do that anymore because there's a building over it. But New York City, I think, was probably because even though you couldn't go down to Penn Station, Philly, even though you couldn't go down to 33rd Street Station, you could still see it on each end. No one in the city of, that's wrong, no one in the borough of Manhattan saw the FDR funeral train.
Right. And how the train, like, where did it commence and where did it?
Okay, so the train took the Amtrak route, what we know today is the Amtrak route. Under the tunnel, through the Bergen portal, into Penn Station, out the Penn Station, over the Hellgate Bridge, and up to the New Rochelle Amtrak station. They reversed the train onto the New York Central, or what do we call it now, Metro North? They reversed the train on Metro North, brought it down to the South Bronx, 149th Street. Again, reversed the train. So if it was coming down from New Rochelle into the Bronx, they reversed it and then went up east, up to Hyde Park. And, okay, I'll give you one, you seem fascinated about this, so I'll give you one more thing.
Okay.
The entire US government was exposed in the pit
Right.
at 149th Street.
Mhm.
Because on one train you had the senators, the president's body and everything else, on one train you had Congress. And the entire US government was
Interesting.
exposed while they switched out,
Mm-hmm.
and they had to switch from the electric to the steam.
Interesting. Wow. No, thank you for sharing that. Any other questions or anecdotes? And also online, do we have anyone that wants to ask a
We
question?
don't have any
Or anecdote
answers
in our online audience?
at the moment.
Anything put it in chat online, folks.
Yes, or you can.
Or you can just speak, unmute
if you
yourself
want, if you
and
have a
ask.
question. I don't see anybody chiming in at the moment.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes,
So
sir.
one quick question, the Baths of Caracalla, I think I was there, and I think they did an opera there, it's a gigantic place. What was, do you know how, what it was the basis of exactly?
Yes. So the Baths of Caracalla, I don't think they would have an opera there.
No,
Doesn't
they
sound
may
right.
have somewhere
It doesn't
else.
sound right. The Baths of Caracalla were built around 200 AD under that emperor. And it's very close to the Roman Colosseum. And the Baths of Caracalla were, it would be like a spa / library / place of both physical and mental enjoyment.
Oh, so it's not that big then?
It's not that big.
Wouldn't be a
I
large
mean,
enough
it's
for
not
an
small
It
and
wouldn't be large
it's
enough for an
inspiring and all that stuff, but it wasn't like that big. I went through it all in person.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else? Any other questions?
I just wanna comment about your comment about the woman that said that when she walks into Penn Station, she feels like a queen and that it belongs to her. And the reason that that stayed with me is because I get that feeling, same feeling, when I walk into Grand Central Station. For me, not to put down Penn Station, but the nowadays Penn Station doesn't have that
No,
impact.
she's
on me.
referring to the original. Penn Station.
Correct, I realized that, I was wondering, she couldn't possibly be talking
No.
about.
This was, I think, before you came, and then
Yeah.
it was around this oral histories, in the 1910s.
Right,
Yeah.
and from the way it looked, I can understand that it would have that
Right.
effect on her,
Right,
like
Yeah.
Grand Central has that effect on her.
You know,
Right.
it was kind of like, I guess, what do you do? I guess you pick a government building or a palace, actually.
Right.
Maybe a European palace with the high ceilings and all.
Right.
And you knew you were in a place that's not common, you know, to walk
Yeah.
into.
exactly.
It's astounding
Yeah.
how completely different the current Penn
Oh, it's-
Station
Right,
is.
but Moynihan, it
Yes.
tries to bring back some of that
Right.
splendor, and
And
they very consciously tried, what I mentioned before with the architectural elements, I mean, even just the art in a more
Right.
centralized way, the throwbacks.
I find Moynihan a little daunting, but I'm there quite often because I'm on the Long Island Railroad, so now I'm gonna check it out.
Now really check it out, and check out some of what we talked about here, look at some of the steel beams, look at some of the original trusses.
The art,
Look at the art, like the
Yeah.
photography that I was telling you about in the waiting room.
yeah,
There's a lot of other interesting and symbolic art, which I cut for this talk, because this talk was really about that. But there's a lot there for you to check out, for sure.
mhm.
And that's part of what architecture is about. Also, this was privately owned, and while that, companies could cut corners and be greedy and all that, in some ways it is easier, because they just made decisions and did it. I mean, I think if you have 20 million cooks in the kitchen, which is what you have now, with, this agency and that agency and the New York government and this state government and this city, it doesn't work. There's too many, because I mean, the proof is in the pudding. It's taken 20 years to get Moynihan really operationally, and, there's all this sort of like babbling about, and it's quite inefficient. So, see, it's a paradox, because while it was Pennsylvania Railroad, they were able to do these things. On the other hand, they were also able to destroy it right away.
What do you feel is inefficient about it?
It's not what I think, it's what has been written up countless times, that it's taken like decades to get the Moynihan that just opened 2 years ago. It took so much longer. A lot of what they're trying to do to revitalize the current Penn Station, just the bureaucratic red tape, the number of years, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of who's huge budgets, who's paying for what, it just becomes sort of a mess, and it loses momentum.
Right.
And the politician who was interested in helping you, now that it's been 5 years, they're not in office,
And the
there's-
final product
And
is
there's a president doesn't
disappointed
care.
because of
Yeah.
the hype.
and the person who replaced them, maybe the politician doesn't care like they did, so
Yeah.
then they're not gonna push it as much, things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, final question,
I think it's really, okay, does anybody else have a question?
or online.
Just want
Yeah,
to mention
please.
that Matt Holland says, as a retired MTA employee, thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Oh.
Matt.
I think it's, it took them 40, 50 years to do it, but at least the Long Island Railroad concourse.
East side access.
At least they saw that it was possible to raise the ceiling. And it's actually nice to walk through now, it doesn't feel so claustrophobic as it did originally.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah, there's a lot more emphasis, I think, on these kinds of things than there was when they built it. I mean, then it was sort of like this modern piece, there was more emphasis on that, sort of this functional, but it has not withstood the test of time, for sure. So, okay, so with that, let's wrap up. Thanks, everyone online.